Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good morning from Washington, D.C. My name is Matthew Goodman. I'm Senior Vice President for Economics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. Delighted to have you with us for Session 2 of our annual Asian Architecture Conference at CSIS. We had the first round last week on October 20th on political and security issues in the region. I commend that to you and encourage you to watch the video of that, which is on the CSIS website. And today we're going to cover economics. This is a conference we've been doing for, close to a decade, I think, usually around this time of year before the annual trips of the U.S. president to the Asia-Pacific region for 2 or 3, depending on how you count it, annual summits. The East Asia Summit is what was the centerpiece of the conversation last week. And this week, we're focused on the leaders meeting, as it's called, of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, or Apec, which is a little known except by this group and people watching this video, a group that does very important work in advancing regional trade and investment, liberalization, integration, and a whole slew of other things that advance prosperity and security in the critical Asia-Pacific region. So this is going to be a very interesting conversation about APEC and the agenda coming up at the leaders meeting in New Zealand, which will be held in mid-November. Actually, it'll be held virtually this year, unfortunately, but New Zealand is the host, and this, I'm sure they're going to put on a great show. Let me first, before we get started, and I hand over to my colleague, Bill Reinsch, let me thank Chevron Corporation for making this event possible. We really appreciate the support of our sponsors that allows us to do programming like this, so thank you very much. I want to encourage the audience to find the button on their screen. If you're on the CSIS homepage or on YouTube, you'll see a button that allows you to ask live questions. Bill, after we go through a panel discussion, will take some of those questions from you. So feel free to start submitting those questions as soon as they occur to you. With that, I think I will hand over to Bill. So Bill Reinsch, who is our director, our Scholl Chair in International Business and Trade. Over to you, Bill.
Thank you very much, Matt, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. We have a really distinguished and knowledgeable panel on this subject. I'm very happy to see them. Matt's going to be one of them, and he's already told you who he is. But in addition, we have Manu Bala, who is the acting senior official for APEC at the Department of State. We have Michael Beeman, who is the assistant U.S. trade representative for Japan, Korea, and APEC. And we have our standby, who is with us nearly every year, Monica Whaley, who is the president of the National Center for APEC, which is a private sector group, NC-APEC. She's been the president since 2009, so she's the veteran of the group here. And it's always good to have Monica with us because she's really in touch with what's going on with respect to APEC in the region in the business community. So what we're going to do is each of them is going to say a few words from their perspective, and then I'll have a short conversation with them, and then we'll turn to your questions. So as Matt said, if you've got questions, as you think of them, put them into the, push the button and do whatever the instructions tell you, and eventually they find their way to me, and I will ask as many as I can. So we decided the order that we would go in is we're going to start with Manu, who's going to tell us a little bit about the U.S. overall objectives for the APEC conference, as well as anything he wants to add about the U.S. Regional U.S. approach to the Indo-Pacific region, and then Michael is going to make the similar comments specifically on trade and what our trade objectives are for APEC. And then we're going to turn to Monica to talk about how the business community is approaching not only APEC, but the APEC CEO Summit, which occurs more or less simultaneously with the Leaders Summit, and which is always a big part of the, when it's not virtual, it's always a big part of the event that occurs wherever the host is. So let's begin with Manu.
Good morning. Thank you, Bill. Delighted to be here with all of you today. Thank you to CSIS for bringing us all together for this important event, and to all the participants, of course, who are joining us today. And a shout out to my very distinguished fellow panelists. Delighted to be with all of you today, this morning as well. So this morning, I will outline U.S. priorities in the lead up to APEC Leaders Week in November, as well as some of the work we have done, undertaken in APEC this year. Just to lay it out broadly, the United States views APEC as the premier platform to advance our economic policies in the Asia-Pacific region, to promote free, fair, and open trade and investment, and advance inclusive and sustainable growth. This year has been an unprecedented year, entirely virtual. Multilateral diplomacy can be challenging in the best of times. It's particularly challenging in a virtual environment. And I have to give credit to our host, New Zealand, for making a decision very early on that this whole year would be virtual. In hindsight, that was an excellent call. It provided us some stability in planning. And New Zealand has done a really great job in managing to maintain an ambitious agenda, even despite the virtual setting. Under the theme of join, work, grow together, New Zealand sought to advance three key priorities for its host year: economic and trade policies that strengthen recovery, increasing inclusion and sustainability for recovery, pursuing innovation and a digitally enabled recovery. New Zealand also prioritized work to reform environmentally harmful subsidies, promote safe and efficient vaccine distribution, and explore how APEC can add to broader conversations on restarting cross-border travel, among other examples. On July 16th, President Biden joined 20 other APEC leaders and representatives from the IMF and WHO virtually at an extraordinary meeting hosted by New Zealand Prime Minister Ardern. The leaders discussed ending the COVID-19 pandemic and supporting the global economic recovery. Throughout the year, the United States has advanced an innovative and practical economic policy agenda that benefits U.S. businesses and workers, including on the digital economy, women's economic empowerment, supply chain resilience, services trade competitiveness, structural reform, and sustainable economic growth. These efforts, along with our work to support those that have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic, will be critical to restoring economic growth and helping economies withstand future shocks. I'll touch on a few of our priorities. On the digital economy, we advanced a set of new and innovative work streams to leverage the digital technologies to respond to COVID-19. First is our project that seeks to promote innovative telehealth solutions across APEC. Under this project, we mapped the existing policy landscape for telehealth services across APEC economies to increase their knowledge of telehealth policies and practices and reduce barriers in this area. Second, we supported a project to highlight cybersecurity risk management policies that can help to prevent massive economic and business operation disruptions. We hosted a virtual cybersecurity policy roundtable for APEC economies and other stakeholders to share resources and best practices. As a result, economies joined consensus on a set of best practice guidelines for policymakers on communicating cybersecurity practices. We are also leading work on digital trade that my colleague from the USTR will be speaking about. And finally, we continue to lead discussions on globalizing the cross-border privacy rule system to allow participation by non-APEC members through the establishment of an independent forum. Moving to women's economic empowerment, which is another top U.S. priority for us in APEC. A U.S.-led partnership between the Small and Medium Enterprises Working Group and the Policy Partnership on Women and the Economy led to the creation of a Women in E-commerce Toolkit to support women entrepreneurs. We rolled out that toolkit with economies through capacity building to support that. We've also sought to measure the legal and regulatory barriers to women's economic participation and provided recommendations to APEC in this regard. During the recent APEC Women and Economy Forum, the State Department's Office of Global Women's Issues emphasized the importance of women's leadership and women-inclusive policies for the pandemic economic recovery. We also highlighted U.S. policies to promote gender equality and equality in domestic budget requests. On structural reform, we continue to push ahead with the long-term work that's required to improving the investment climate and the regulatory environment in the region. Our work on structural reform will be critical to restoring economic growth and helping economies withstand future shocks. In June, the structural reform ministers launched the Enhanced APEC Agenda on Structural Reform, or known as the EASR, and the third Ease of Doing Business Action Plan. With the discontinuation of the World Bank's Doing Business report, we are thinking of ways to reinvigorate our work on working with APEC economies to foster an enabling business environment in APEC. We have furthered our work on good regulatory practices by hosting a workshop on expediting public consultation processes in urgent situations, underscoring the need for governments to be responsive in a rapidly changing regulatory environment. Very recently, APEC finance ministers came together on October 22nd, where they highlighted the importance of the IMF's recent allocation of special drawing rights to help with economic recovery and health-related expenditures, as well as the push for an effective global minimum tax. I'd like to shift gears to the Putrajaya Vision that APEC leaders endorsed last year to chart our course for the next 20 years through 2040. The vision is very clear. It states, an open, dynamic, resilient, and peaceful Asia-Pacific community by 2040 for the prosperity of all our people and future generations. It aims to do this through three economic drivers, which are trade and investment, innovation and digitalization, strong, balanced, secure, sustainable, and inclusive growth. And of course, there's also an effort to focus on continuous improvement of APEC as an institution. We've been working hard over the past several months with other APEC economies to finalize the implementation plan for the Putrajaya Vision, which will actualize this vision, including by developing individual and collective actions. This will be one of New Zealand's key deliverables for this year and will help lay the foundation for APEC's work over the next 2 decades. And finally, I would like to turn to 2023. As I expect many of you are aware, Vice President Harris announced the U.S. offer to host APEC in 2023. Hosting requires a consensus of all members, and we are working on securing that consensus and expect to make a formal announcement in November. The United States offered to host APEC in 2023 because we attach a high priority to APEC as a premier platform to advance our economic policies in the Asia-Pacific region. APEC is also an innovative leader in tackling issues that affect every domestic and international marketplace. We want to continue to see APEC serve as an incubator of ideas that can help shape the economic architecture, especially as we implement this new vision over the next 20 years. Once again, thank you for your time, and I look forward to our conversation this morning. Over to you, Bill. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, with that, Michael, let's zero in specifically on trade.
Great, thank you. Good morning to you. Thank you. I join Manu in thanking CSIS, to you, Bill, to you, Matt, for bringing this together and putting a spotlight back on a very important part of our work in the region, which I know is a focus of the umbrella focus of your initiative here. I think, as you can suspect, we are, of course, looking at APEC and the opportunities that this forum presents through the foundational lens that the Biden-Harris administration brings, which is the belief that trade can and should be a force for good, and one that encourages a race to the top, and that also addresses global challenges as they arise. And APEC, with its informal, non-binding nature, from our perspective, remains an ideal forum for moving the administration's trade agenda and these priorities forward in the region. It is also an excellent forum since while APEC maintains many of the core areas of focus on which it was founded, the discussions in APEC have evolved a great deal over time. I think if someone had sort of tuned out of APEC about 10, 20 years ago and tuned back in, I think they would begin to understand just how much has evolved in this direction, essentially taking on a stronger character of focusing on how trade can better serve all of our people, and through much stronger focus in areas such as inclusion and overcoming common challenges like the environment and addressing emerging issues like the digital economy, which were not issues when APEC was founded. So, and this is not just my view. I've heard Ambassador Tai in meetings and I think publicly as well indicate her strong support for the opportunities that APEC presents to engage and explore trade and investment issues and do so away from some of the challenging negotiating dynamics that we see in other institutions and forums that have been oftentimes very difficult to overcome. In addition, it's important to us that a wider range of stakeholders have an opportunities to see themselves, their concerns, and their priorities in the work that we are undertaking in APEC. And so this is another priority for Ambassador Tai and for us moving ahead. The Manu is laid out sort of New Zealand's host year priorities and how they have fit with many of the areas that we have been, the United States has been working very hard during this virtual APEC year to realize and see outcomes and to inject energy into. Let me just highlight in the trade area a handful to give you some examples. In the area of supply chains and resiliency, obviously, the pandemic and its impact on supply chains has really underscored the importance of these topics, and including, for example, in the area of expedited implementation of the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement. This is a way in which we can support the WTO and help support the focus on making supply chains most efficient and resilient as possible. And we were pleased that all APEC economies, for example, agreed in the trade minister's statement in 2021 in June to accelerate implementation in this direction. So we're working through APEC to support this agenda as just one example of our active work in this space. In the area of environment, we have been strong supporters of New Zealand's focus on sustainability, and a key part of incentivizing for us a race to the top is making our trade initiatives more supportive of such objectives. So, for example, we have been focusing a lot of work in area on trade and sustainable materials and looking at new ways to advance trade in recoverable e-waste materials and other very specific areas like such as that, in addition to some of the bigger themes that Manu outlined. On the digital front, this is obviously a very interesting and important area for all APEC economies. And the nature of the discussion is quite interesting as it's evolved. There is obviously a very important interest in how APEC can bring value added in this space. And for a lot of APEC economies, issues like AI, issues like 5G or the Internet of Things are kind of unknown spaces or unclear exactly how policies can best support and appropriately address concerns with these types of issues. So we have been actually for some time and have been accelerating our work here through hosting trade policy dialogues in this space. For example, most recently tried to examine the issue of how data flows can contribute to a more inclusive digital economy, how small businesses and entrepreneurs in Indonesia or in Thailand or in remote areas of Chile can benefit through policies that support this approach. So that's an example of the kind of discussions we're having in APEC to try and bring better understanding and obviously work toward more consensus on some of these very challenging issues. Then on inclusion, let me just end with this point. We certainly support the growing focus on inclusion issues in APEC, including in the trade space as well, including with New Zealand as host, who has really made this a priority this year. we are actively thinking of new ways to contribute moving forward, obviously looking ahead to 2023 as well. And I think you'll be hearing a lot more from us in this space. So let me just end there. Many other things I could refer to, but I think it gives you a sense of where we're heading in this space. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that elaboration. Monica, bring in the business perspective for us, please.
Well, there's a reason why we wanted to be sure that I wanted to be sure that Manu and Michael went first, because they laid the groundwork for me and I just skate on top of it. I want to thank CSIS and Matt and Bill and the team there at CSIS that puts us together every year. It's always a terrific opportunity, and I thank you for allowing us to be part of it. And I also want to add my congratulations to New Zealand. This has been extremely challenging this year, and actually last year and the year before that, all challenging years for APEC the last several years. So New Zealand has done a really good job navigating that, and I think that's just very commendable. For the APEC Business Advisory Council, which is the official business body advising the APEC leaders and APEC ministers, their main deliverable every year is this ABAC report to leaders. And usually ABAC would meet 4 times or 3 times throughout the year, and then at the final meeting, the 4th time, to develop this report. Well, this year, the meeting just sort of has never stopped. The working groups and the task forces have all been meeting throughout the year, and they've come up with over 40 recommendations, ranging from COVID economic recovery to the digital economy, regional economic integration, inclusion, finance, trade, and sustainability. And you'll see that there's a lot of common themes throughout, depending on no matter what you're talking about. We find out what the impact of COVID was. We try to digitalize it and then try to decarbonize it. So it seems to be that's sort of a pattern here. The ABAC report, I'll commit it to you, it's releasing shortly, has good annexes on recommendations for reopening borders, the World Trade Organization recommendations, and climate change, renewable energy, and economic inclusion for indigenous people, among other topics. But the big, obviously, the business communities, one of their major foci is reopening travel. And I think it really, the COVID-19 pandemic opened our eyes to the weaknesses in that system, and entire sectors and industries that had to go on pause during that time and affected millions of people, particularly those who rely on the movement of people for travel, tourism, and business, a tremendous amount of business throughout the APEC economies. The APEC Policy Support Unit, which is sort of a think tank connected to the APEC Secretariat in Singapore, found that the cross-border arrivals on flights in 2020 decreased by 75% from the previous year. And border restrictions and closures have mitigated the pandemic spread, but the trade, economic, and societal impact has been substantial as well. The PSU estimates that the losses due to the fall in cross-border movement of people ranges from about 500 billion to 800 billion. And the losses from unrealized economic activity was estimated at 1.2 trillion US dollars. So as an impact of these tremendous losses, APEC is keen to facilitate the safe reopening of borders. And this is top of mind, obviously, in many of the ABAC working groups. And they took up this topic for the report of leaders. And there's a set of recommendations therein to address this issue. The other major element affecting all businesses, obviously, is supply chains, and both Manu and Michael touched upon supply chains. Building on the 2021 APEC Minister Statement, which was excellent. Looking ahead, and APEC members hope that there'll be strengthening protocols that facilitate the international movement of workers that support cross-border supply chains, including sort of aircraft crew, seafarers, vehicle operators. So we hope that APEC can support establishing and maintaining green lanes for goods related to the COVID-19 pandemic response. And then APEC economies can aid private sector responses to COVID-19 by establishing cross-ministry coordination bodies to ensure coherence within economies, bolstering emergency preparedness planning, and expanding collaboration efforts with the private sector to understand the depths of supply chains. In ABAC's report to leaders, ABAC calls on APEC to reject all forms of protectionism and vaccine nationalism in responding to the pandemic. This includes coordinating free and open trade in vaccines and an agreed list of essential medical supplies. So as I said before, we want to digitalize and decarbonize just about everything, so supply chains are no exception. Despite the clear need for a secure digital trade and supply chain connectivity system, there are still gaps in the region that prevent end-to-end digitalization. And ABAC is recommending to APEC leaders to address these gaps by developing a regional implementation plan for a suite of global data standards in digital systems to improve supply chain visibility, interoperability, and integrity, and establish interoperable paperless trade systems across the region. As far as decarbonization, all the economies are working toward these decarbonization efforts, and NCAPEC and the U.S. private sector encourage APEC to develop a framework that supports the decarbonization of regional supply chains. We've already begun exploring such a framework. In fact, later today are going to be holding a supply chain decarbonization workshop, and those of you interested in joining us for that are more than welcome to sign up for that. And I think there's a link on our webpage, which is ncapec.org. ABAC is also working on sustainability, as is the rest of APEC, and this is again a thread that runs through the whole set of working groups and processes. ABAC has developed a set of climate leadership principles for business, and the principles will guide the development of climate-related business practices and policies and serve as a model for more robust action to address climate change within and outside the APEC region, and also serve as encouragement to APEC's economies, climate-related policies, responses, and ambitions. And as you can imagine, with the variety of economies that are in APEC, they're at very different places on the spectrum of zero carbonization. Digital trade was obviously another huge area, again, that spread throughout the working groups, and the ABAC report to leaders recommended 4 things in terms of digital trade. First is to create an enabling environment for MSMEs, medium, small, and medium enterprises, micro, small, and medium enterprises. So this is a major emphasis for ABAC. There are many ways that enabling digital trade can support MSME growth. But an example from the support is by championing interoperable e-invoicing is something that was noted as a particular benefit to MSMEs. And the second recommendation is interoperable digital systems. This audience knows that there's serious splintering in digital trade systems and its regulation around the world, and ABAC wants APEC leaders to address the gaps that prevent end-to-end digitalization of the supply chain. So this also relates to the services side. Data flow restrictions related to privacy regulations have increased in the region, and ABAC wants APEC leaders to increase the dialogue with business about the impact of these regulations, especially in terms of interoperability. The third ABAC recommendation on digital is to support an enabling environment for emerging technologies for economic growth. ABAC is just about to release a report about APEC economy's readiness to deploy AI, for example, just in the coming weeks. We've got that report coming out. And lastly, ABAC continues to advocate for the longstanding recommendations for the WTO on trade-related aspects of e-commerce, calling for a permanent moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions, and in general, achieving concrete outcomes on necessary reforms to WTO's rules and processes. We'll be following the MC12 outcomes in December closely for the basis of next year's work. There are also APEC initiatives, and Manu mentioned some of these earlier, and Michael too, the U.S. initiatives that's leading on cybersecurity, expanding the cross-border privacy rule system, expanding broadband to rural areas, and the USTR just did a digital trade policy dialogue. So there's a lot happening on digital, and we expect to continue to be a focus. Another element that the ABAC led on in the digital area was in the area of e-signatures and know your customer, e-KYC. And this is obviously, again, in response to COVID, or COVID has actually allowed us to sort of illuminate the challenge of those interactions which cannot happen person to person when you're in the middle of a pandemic. And so the digitalization, we need to see the rapid uptake in specific sectors, but specifically in the financial services sector. Some of the priorities identified by our companies, including recognition and regulations surrounding the digital onboarding of new customers, the acceptance of electronic and digital signatures, advancing digital identity schemes, and electronic know your customer regulations. Some of these laws are already on the books for some of these topics, but we're working within the APEC working groups and within ABAC and within the Asia Pacific Financial Forum to achieve greater recognition to make digitalization efforts easier. So we're prepared to continue to offer services even in global pandemics. And just the status of the economic relationship between the economies, I know we're going to touch on that, but one of the greatest advantages and challenges of APEC is that it is consensus-based. And I know some people think of it as the perfect excuse to chat, but it's important to the APEC process, and I think it actually gives it an advantage in this particular time and place in our global economic history. And it certainly is challenging at times, but I think it's worth the effort. That's why I think the National Center for APEC has thrown itself so fully behind the idea of the U.S. hosting APEC in 2023. This summer, when Vice President Harris was in Singapore, and she announced that we had been working quite hard to advocate for this to happen. We think it's an excellent thing for the United States. But with about 18 months to go before December of 2022, when the reins are handed over between Thailand, the next host, and the 2023 host, it's important to have an APEC economy lined up to take those reins. And I've been involved at two other times when the U.S. chaired APEC in 1993 and in 2011, and I'm confident in our ability to host again. And at this point, we're waiting for that official announcement. Manu discussed what we should be seeing sometime during Leaders Week, and so the National Center advocated for this outcome, and we're looking forward to the U.S.'s likely hosting of APEC in 2023 and helping in any way we can. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Monica. Before I go to Matt, let me just ask you, are the recommendations that you mentioned from ABAC also on your website?
They are released within a day or so. Yes, so they will be. I just don't know if they're actually what time it is in New Zealand and whether they've been delivered to Prime Minister Ardern yet, but I believe they are.
But once they are, they'll be public. Okay.
Yes.
Right. Okay, Matt Goodman, wrap it all up for us.
Okay, thanks, Bill, and thanks to colleagues for those great explanations of what's on the agenda. It's a broad one, obviously. Actually, before I make my own comments, let me just, as player manager, let me encourage the audience again to submit questions. If you have them, you can use that button on your screen to submit questions that Bill will try to get to a couple of those later on. So let me just make 3 or 4 points about APEC. First of all, APEC matters. It's easy to be sort of cynical, and frankly, when you hear that broad agenda covering so many different issues, even for folks like us who are policy wonks and appreciate and fans of APEC, can find it a little bewildering sometimes. But it really matters, and I usually talk about it in kind of 3 levels. All these kind of summits like this, I think, share similar features. There are 3 big things they do. One is they drive an agenda. So they put out there issues like trade liberalization at the broadest level, digital, the importance of the digital economy, women's empowerment, other aspects of inclusion, as Michael stressed. Inclusion is going to be a big theme this year, and I think that's the kind of thing that gets people's attention to issues that maybe they hadn't thought about as much or in the kind of detail that APEC goes into. So the agenda setting function of APEC is really important. Secondly, it can specifically solve problems and get things done, move an agenda forward in very specific ways. And so, a decade ago when I was involved in organizing the last U.S. host year in Honolulu in 2011, we actually, our slogan that year was "Get Stuff Done." At least that was the PG version of the slogan. Monica is smiling because she remembers well. And we were trying to really drive some very specific things. So, for example, the environmental goods agreement in the WTO had been stalled for many years, and we used a very creative approach, which I won't go into in detail, to try and drive progress on environmental goods, and it got the negotiations going again, and they've since bogged down again. But still, it's a very useful forum, APEC, for moving forward things in a very tangible, concrete way. And then thirdly, APEC is important because it builds habits of cooperation. This is important at all levels, at the sort of official level, there are a lot of people like Manu and Michael across the 21 economies of APEC who are interacting regularly. You heard some of the meetings they've had during the year. In Monica's case, you hear business people who are engaging throughout the year and making connections. So you have just a vast network of connections that are being made, and people sharing ideas and best practices and moving issues forward within their own economy. So it's really important. I know that sounds kind of wonky and bureaucratic, but I can't tell you how powerful that is. It's also, the habits of cooperation are also at the leaders level. I know that, again, it's easy to be cynical about this, but the president of the United States doesn't have a lot of friends. That is, I mean, they just don't interact with their peers all that much. This is actually an opportunity at least once a year for the president to sit down with his peers and talk about common challenges. And I've seen that dynamic again in the room in Honolulu. There was of all things, on good regulatory practices, there was a luncheon discussion where the leaders talked about the challenges they'd each had in trying to get deregulation going, or just get smarter regulation. It's very powerful, and so I think this is a really important function of APEC. So my sort of last point on APEC itself would be that I think I would encourage New Zealand and Michael and Manu and others who may be involved in the actual agenda here to think in terms of getting stuff done. There's a broad agenda there, but try and get a few tangible things done. It will help advance some good outcomes in themselves, but it'll also make the rest of us a little less cynical, because we'll see there's actually some value to this, and it makes some significant progress. So I hope there can be some specific takeaways on some of the issues that Manu and Michael laid out. And so that's what I'm going to be watching for. The final point I'm going to make in my opening thoughts is about the broader importance of this opportunity for President Biden going into this forum in a few weeks. The United States has been engaged economically in the Asia Pacific for actually our entire existence. If you want to go back to 1784, I'll tell you the story of the Empress of China that carried goods to Asia. It's always been a part of our history, particularly since 1989 when APEC was founded. Economic strategy in the region has revolved around the kind of work that's being done in APEC, and it's really, really important for the U.S. to show up in these forums like APEC, but also to put forward an agenda that is credible and that economies in the region want from the United States. They do want us there as a political and security force in the region, but they also want us there as an economic actor for the long term, and that particularly means they want us engaged on trade. So I think the speech that President Biden is presumably going to give at the APEC CEOs Summit the day before the leaders meeting, I assume I've got that sort of basic scheduling right, but anyway, he's going to give a speech while he's involved with APEC. And in that speech, he really needs to lay out a credible economic strategy, and it's got to have trade in it. And we'll talk more about this, but I think the U.S. has to lean a lot further forward on our engagement on trade in this important region. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Okay, thanks to all of you for laying out a whole bunch of issues. Let me begin with a couple sort of basic questions probably for Manu first, just factual ones. The president is going to participate in the summit and in the CEO summit. Is that right?
Bill, the president has certainly been invited to the economic leaders meeting and to the CEO summit, and we are working to confirm participation. It has not been confirmed at this stage, but we are working with the NSC, and of course, we all understand the importance of these events and our participation in those.
Okay, going on, let me pursue a little bit the question of the 2023 summit. I gather that I was a little surprised. I sort of assumed that if somebody volunteered to be a host, everyone else would say great, because they didn't want to do it. and because it costs money. I gather this time not everybody has said great, but you expect to work out the difficulties and be able to announce that we're going to host?
Bill, again, thank you for that question as well. So, APEC works on a consensus basis. So all economies have to join consensus on decisions and outcomes, and it is a similar decision when it comes to hosting. Hosting works on a volunteer basis. It resets every year, and Thailand is hosting in 2022. And we were very glad the United States was able to step up and present its offer to host in 2023. There was no other economy that had offered to do so. And we are working to secure consensus and hopefully be able to announce that at the leaders meeting. But again, till we do that, we should not take anything for granted, of course, but we are hopeful that we'll get there.
Well, let's turn to a couple other areas. Several of you mentioned, I think, what I'm sure all of our listeners know is that these things don't entirely happen out of context. There are other things going on. There are other international organizations that exist, and two of them are the WTO, which is having its ministerial conference at the end of November, and the other one is COP26 in Glasgow, which starts in just a couple days. Which the president is going to be participating in. And APEC has had a role, and I think several of you alluded to this, and on the environmental front for some time, particularly the Environmental Goods Agreement, the EGA. So let's sort of start with that question. I think the point was made that APEC, through its own initiative that was adopted by APEC members, I think gave a significant push to the EGA negotiations at the WTO, which subsequently did not get across the finish line for reasons probably everybody knows we don't need to spend time on. So does APEC have a role in trying to get that moving again? Does it make sense to try to get it moving again? What is APEC focusing on that at all? And what might it do, having played an initial role in the beginning? Is there something it can do to help restart? Anybody want to pick that one up?
Michael?
Sure, I'm happy to. I think this sounds like a USTR question, so if you just step in.
Yes, and I have to say, USTR so far has been conspicuously silent in its own support for or interest in EGA negotiations. So maybe you can comment on that as well.
Sure. Well, I would just say I'm not the EGA spokesperson in terms of what's going on at the WTO, but let me explain kind of how this has evolved in the APEC context. Obviously, I mean, I think as you are well aware, as your question suggests, this is how to move forward. And the issue of facilitating trade in environmental goods and services has been the broader topic, has been a focus of New Zealand's for this year. And there has been some work going on in this space. I want to separate this from what may or may not happen in the WTO, but just talk about APEC at this point. Actually, since it has been some time since that list was agreed to, and actually within APEC, there's been a more of a technical exercise, which is an important one, to update actually to make it consistent with the current HS codes or the most recent HS codes, and also just to expand a discussion in APEC on what goods, and then also now looking at potentially what services in this space can facilitate trade in these important products and services. So that is the sort of the starter discussion, sort of rekindling a focus in this area within APEC. Our view on how APEC is best situated vis-a-vis the WTO is that it should serve as an incubator of ideas, right? And it's really up to the WTO membership to carry them forward if they want to see them in some sort of binding outcomes. And then on the backside, and that's not the case, as you mentioned, with the environment, there's no agreement yet in the WTO, is the issue of implementation and helping support capacity building and other support for the obligations that are agreed in Geneva after they're agreed, basically. So that's sort of the maybe ecosystem is sort of the way I would describe it here. So there is some initial work. It's not, doesn't prejudice whether we would be moving forward and trying to push new things into the WTO. We want to be very clear about that. But what APEC can do is to generate discussions without prejudice as to where that could end up, and focus on how we can, in other ways as well, facilitate trade in these goods and services. So that's where we are right now.
Does anybody else want to comment on that one? Okay. Are there other things that APEC can do to support what's going on at the WTO? I mean, we've got, thinking about the ministerial, we've got fisheries as a big issue. We've also got the vaccine waiver issue, which is both of which I think are regionally important issues in Asia. And I think Monica alluded to trade facilitation agreement implementation and the role that APEC can play there. How active do you expect APEC to be on some of these issues? Michael, that may be for you again.
About to say, I just unmuted myself for that reason. Yeah, I mean, and yes, I think that, you know, in addition to being the incubator of ideas and being help to facilitate implementation of obligations, there is a role, and this is traditionally done through the minister discussions, sometimes leader discussions, but also through the statements that are attached to those meetings. On, you know, maybe the best way to describe it is being a cheerleader, if you will, for outcomes in the WTO. And if you, I think, look back at the trade minister statement in June, you'll see that reference, and I'm sure you'll see some references in that area as well, going forward for the statements that will be coming out in November. So yeah, obviously, you know, addressing harmful fishery subsidies is a top, you know, concern for one of the top concerns of the United States, and utilizing APEC as a forum to help drive and push and inject momentum into trying to reach an outcome is certainly something that, you know, that we fully support. Just to give you one example.
Okay.
I'm not the expert on the specifics of those trade agreements, but I would endorse the basic idea that you're getting at, Bill, which is that, you know, the APEC leaders have a real chance to drive toward some specific progress at the ministerial later this year. You know, and if it's fisheries or environmental goods or the vaccine waiver or something, if they can drive that, they did that several years ago with the trade facilitation agreement. They were quite helpful in giving that a strong nudge, and I think that's the kind of dynamic I hope that the leaders will lean into next month in New Zealand.
Monica, do you see that happening? Go ahead.
Well, I would just say that if it doesn't happen, it wouldn't be for lack of New Zealand trying. New Zealand is really devoted to the WTO and what the opportunities that has opened for that economy to play really an outsized role in the region and globally. They've got very strong WTO support. So they've been in through the ABAC and I think through the officials process too, just being very positive in the chair role. This is one of the things a chair can do, is to help drive issues like that. And I think that's something we ought to be keeping a keen eye on as we look ahead to 2023. What are the kinds of things we want to emphasize going through if we get to chair? But for the New Zealanders, the WTO has definitely been one of their one of their dear hopes that there comes out of the APEC leaders meeting and ministers meetings a push for the WTO.
Okay, one of the things that all of you have mentioned, I think, has been in various ways, has been digitization, digital trade, digitally enabled recovery, which is one of New Zealand's themes that I think were mentioned. Let me start with Matt about this. These are issues where I think it's very easy to agree they're all important, and they certainly are, but there's also pretty clearly quite a range of issues. Let me rephrase that. Quite a range of opinions and views on digital trade issues involving privacy, data location, national security, access to source code, algorithms. The AI debate is going to be a critical part of that. It's not at all clear that that everybody, either in APEC or actually the rest of the world, are all in the same place on this. So are there areas of convergence where APEC members can take advantage to prevent the internet from further fragmenting? Can they start some process going like they did on EGA that might help us get over the pretty deep divisions on this? Matt, do you want to start?
Sure. I think so is the answer to your question. I hope so. Look, I mean, we're creating data here in this call, and yet there are no internationally agreed rules on, sort of how this should be, accessed or stored, or, how the flow should be enabled. There are pockets of rules here and there, but there are not internationally agreed rules. It's really one of the biggest holes in the kind of ozone of the international economic order. So it is critically important. And APEC is, and the Asia Pacific more broadly, is an important theater or place to have conversations about the digital economy. And APEC has stepped up and done quite a lot, as has been enumerated, including its cross-border privacy rules, which are really an important contribution to the question of how data can flow, subject to appropriate privacy and other protections. So I think there is a chance, in fact, almost an obligation in some way, for APEC to talk about these issues and try to move towards more of a consensus, at least within that group of 21 economies, which do represent plus or minus half the world's GDP. So if they can agree on something, then that can really have an impact on the global debate. I would also just like to put in a plug for other things going on in the region, like in particular, and others have heard me say this before, I've written about it, the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, DEPA, which is another acronym, but it is a little grouping of Singapore, Chile, and New Zealand who have reached an agreement to have a conversation about the digital economy. There are 12 or so modules of conversation about data flows, about security, about AI. Ethics is in there. Inclusion is in there. SME access to the digital economy. It's a really great platform, and I personally would like to see the United States just join. And I'm pretty sure those three countries would be happy to have the U.S. Be part of that conversation. And so I think in APEC and in related initiatives in the region, I think this is a huge opportunity, and I certainly hope the U.S. will lean into that even next month, but certainly going beyond that as well.
Well, on that last point, Michael or Manu, any comments on what the U.S. government's attitude is on DEPA and some of these other digital issues? Don't all volunteer at once. Michael, go ahead.
I was waiting. Well, I think some of the issues that have been raised are really cross-cutting in terms of kind of how the U.S. government is approaching the topics, issues of access to the internet and things like that are much broader topics. No, I mean, I don't have. I think I'll just keep my comments at what we're doing in APEC, and I think in many ways are aligning with some of what Matt is getting at here, which is that there are a lot of complicated issues in this space, but that doesn't mean, in fact, the opposite of being just simply complicated. They're also extremely important. They're extremely important to get right as well as technology evolves, and that certainly doesn't mean we should be sitting on our hands, which I can assure you we're not. We see APEC as a good forum, as an excellent forum to try and bring about better understanding and consensus on some of the most important challenges and topics in this space. The moment, and I would just make this point more generally, the moment that it feels like we're trying to move towards something in APEC that becomes a binding outcome, sometimes those discussions actually can get much harder very quickly. And so we want to bring in a lot of points of view. And this is the approach that we've been taking through these digital trade forums that have been mentioned, that I mentioned, and in trying to bring together better understanding so that when there are discussions outside the space, about, potential future initiatives, or, obviously in the WTO in that space, there's a discussion going on there. How that can help support that. And there are a lot of, views on these issues. And so just trying to shine a light on good practices and why addressing some of these issues makes a difference through the lens of consumers, through the lens of workers, through the lens of businesses is really, where our focus is in APEC at this time.
If I could just jump in, Bill, for a quick minute there. I think this really is one of the strengths of APEC, in that these issues that are not already locked down in all kinds of age-old treaties and things like that, the new areas, new issues is really where APEC can shine at sort of sharing the best practices and exploring, being a test kitchen for various things. I think that's really where it does some of its best work.
If I might add, Bill, as well, I referred to the Putrajaya Vision earlier. Digitalization and the digital economy is 1/3 of that vision. It is one of the 3 economic drivers. We are spending a great deal of time on fleshing out the implementation plan for that, which you should all be seeing later in a few weeks' time. And there is absolutely no doubt that the digital economy is something that's at the forefront of APEC's agenda, and ours as well, of course, ranging from some practical areas which there's a lot of cooperation on, such as the telehealth initiative that I mentioned earlier, because it provides practical benefits for almost everybody, to some of the thornier issues such as cross-border data flows, which we are tackling through approaches such as the CBPR.
Okay. We've got some audience questions, and we have just a few minutes left, so let's turn to those. One of them was about digital trade, and I think we pretty much covered that one. The other one I'm sure you were anticipating, and this comes from Marie Kissel of Abbott. Who wants to talk about Thailand's goals for their upcoming host year, especially on travel reopening efforts? Anybody want to take that one on? We always there's a every Asian architecture conference I participate in, always somebody asks not about this year but about next year. So this is the chance. What are the Thais going to do, Manu?
Great. So Thailand, as an incoming host for next year, has not made any official announcement as of yet on what their priorities are going to be. So I don't want to be too far-reaching on their behalf, certainly. That would be wrong of me. We've started to have some informal consultations, of course. And I would also note that they are trying their best to host in-person meetings if COVID-19 and travels situations allow, and that also is, of course, a very positive step. From what we understand, their preliminary priorities will, of course, include the traditional trade and investment liberalization agenda, which has been part of APEC's mainstream for the last 3 decades. Also a strong focus on connectivity, and that is a very broad term, of course, but a strong focus on restarting travel and tourism. Those are very important areas to them, to the business community, and for the region as a whole. And then also on sustainable and inclusive growth with something known as a biocircular green economy model that's been widely deployed there. And so those, I think, are the broad strokes priorities. We expect they will enunciate, but we should certainly await them doing so themselves before taking it too far. Thank you.
Monica, is your sense consistent with that? Do you have other insights on what they're going to do?
Well, we did some preliminary meetings with the NCAPEC board with some of the different ministries that are working on things, and I completely concur with what Manu's assessment was. But specifically to Marie's question, they are one that COVID-19 has impacted hugely because tourism is such an important part of their economy, and they are really dedicated to the idea of trying to make sure some of the meetings happen in person and to bring back that element to the region. I know for the ABAC side, they're ambitious. They want us to have at least 2 live meetings before the 3rd meeting this year. So we'll see if that can happen without people spending 2 and 3 weeks in quarantine on either side of their trip. But I think this is definitely one of their emphases.
Michael, do you want to add anything in particular? What has USTR begun to think about what we would like them to focus on?
Oh, well, suggest to provide some free advice to Thailand. I will say that the Thai senior official is just superb, and I'm sure we will have wonderful, not only continue our wonderful discussions with them looking forward, but we'll put a lot of trust and faith in their instincts and their priorities and try and help support them as we move forward.
If I could have one more thing, Bill, sorry. Just from the meetings that the Nancy Apec had with some of the different ministries, and we've done this now several years, meeting in the prior year with the next year's host, just to sort of get a sense of their thinking. And I do have to say they are interagency really coordinated on their messaging. They've done a lot of thinking about this. They haven't unveiled it all yet, but I know that just to the point that Michael was saying about their senior official being superb, I couldn't agree more. And that seems to go throughout the different agencies. And in some years we've done this, and one agency hasn't even known that they really have a role in APEC for that year. So this is really, they're doing a great job, at least doing their planning and their strategic kind of layout of messaging and communications.
Okay, well, the hour has arrived. Matt, do you want to?
Can I just say one final thing? I know it's overtime now, but something that I sort of talked about in code but didn't say explicitly before, and Thailand sort of reminded me of it because it's one of the long queue of countries that has expressed some interest in joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership or its successor agreement, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP. And that reminds me that when I was talking about the U.S. leaning in, I still feel, and I know this is a controversial view that I'll get thrown tomatoes at for saying, but I still think it's in the clear, compelling U.S. national interest to be part of that agreement or some equivalent high standard comprehensive regional trade agreement. So I think that's something that I hope that President Biden will sort of lean into. And at least show some body language about U.S. That, as I expressed it, longer term interest in being part of high standard comprehensive regional trade arrangements.
Well, no tomatoes for me. I agree with you. And I won't put our government people on the spot on that one unless either of you wants to say something, but you probably do it at your peril. So I won't ask. And Monica, I suspect I know where you are on that question. So why don't we, since we are a little bit over time, why don't we bring it to an end? Thank you all. Thank you to the panel for some very insightful, thoughtful comments. Thanks to all of you for listening. And we will see what happens early next month at the summit. And I'm sure we will be back next year with another Asian architecture event for you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.